The Force binds all things across the galaxy, connecting every living being in an invisible web that stretches from the core worlds to the outer rim. But what happens when two women who died for that galaxy are given the one thing death never offers, a second chance, and the memory of everything that went wrong? Ahsoka Tano opened her eyes to white light and the distant hum of something that was not quite the Force, and not quite anything else she recognized. She was standing, no, she realized, floating, in a space that had no walls, no floor, no ceiling. Beside her, Leia Organa blinked awake with the sharp, controlled breath of a woman who had spent a lifetime waking into crisis. This isn't the netherworld of the Force, Ahsoka said quietly, more to herself than to Leia. She could feel it, the absence of that particular resonance, the cosmic murmur she'd come to know intimately, in her final moments among the Force spirits of the Jedi who came before her. No, said a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, dripping with amusement. It isn't. Welcome, ladies, to somewhere considerably more interesting. A man appeared before them, if man was even the word. He wore what might have been a Republic senator's robes. If Republic senators dressed like they'd raided a costume shop with no sense of era, mixing high Republic finery with a First Order officer's collar and, absurdly, a pair of Coruscant sunglasses perched atop his head. He smiled with the particular delight of a being who had been waiting a very long time to make an entrance. Who are you? Leia asked, already moving into the posture Ahsoka recognized from 100 hollow recordings of Bail Organa's daughter facing down. Imperial officers, chin level, spine straight, giving nothing away. I've gone by many names. You may call me Q. He clasped his hands behind his back and began to pace through the non-existent floor as though it were the finest marble corridor in Thebe Palace. I am, shall we say, a connoisseur of interesting timelines. Yours was magnificent, by the way. Tragic, certainly. Overwrought in places, but magnificent. Ahsoka felt Leia's presence beside her sharpen, wary. Ahsoka herself had learned long ago that wariness alone rarely served her as well as patience did. You brought us back, she said. It wasn't a question. I brought you back, Hugh confirmed, with everything intact. Every memory, every scar, every skill you ever earned across two very full, very complicated lives. Ahsoka Tano Togruta, Jedi trained, Jedi abandoned, rebel, wanderer, the woman who faced down a Sith Lord's apprentice and lived to regret it only a little. He turned to Leia, and Leia Organa, princess, general, Jedi, in all but formal training, mother to a line that very nearly saved the galaxy and very nearly didn't. Why? Leia said flatly. Hugh's grin widened. Because I'm bored, Your Highness, and because I find myself, on occasion, sentimental about mortal struggle in a way my fellow Continuum members find distasteful. You have knowledge no one in this era possesses. You have power neither of you had the first time you were young, enough to use it properly. I'm giving you the chance to see what you do with it. The light around them shifted, resolving into the shape of a corridor, sleek, unfamiliar, humming with a kind of technology neither woman recognized. Viewports lined the walls, and beyond them hung the swirling blue tunnel of something that was not hyperspace as either of them knew it. This is the Vigilant, Hugh said, gesturing grandly at the ship materializing around them. A gift, consider it borrowed, indefinitely, from a rather more disciplined organization in a rather different corner of existence. It goes where you point it, faster than anything your galaxy has built, and it will not ask questions about the destination I'm about to give you. Which is? Ahsoka asked, though some cold certainty was already forming in her chest. 33 years before the fall of your republic, Hugh said, and for the first time something like genuine gravity entered his voice. 1 year before an old Jedi Master finds a 9-year-old slave boy on a desert planet and decides the Force wills that boy's freedom. You know how that story ends, don't you? Windu, Kenobi, the Council, the war, the fire, the suit, the Emperor's throne room. Leia's jaw tightened. Ahsoka said nothing at all. Her montrals had gone rigid. Every instinct she possessed screaming at the shape of what Q was offering. I am not telling you what to do with this, Q continued, softer now. I am not fixing anything for you. I am simply putting two women who love that boy in your very different ways back in the room before the story was written. What you do from there is entirely, deliciously your own affair. Though I should warn you, his eyes glittered. Time does not appreciate being rewritten. The more you change, the less certain your own memories become. You may find the future you remember growing thinner, less reliable, the longer you tug at its threads. Before either could respond, the corridor lurched, not with turbulence, but with arrival. The viewport ahead cleared to show a world of endless ochre dunes beneath twin suns. Achingly, impossibly familiar. Tatooine, Leia breathed. Tatooine, Hugh agreed, already fading from view, his voice trailing after him like smoke. 1 year early. Do try not to break anything too important. And then he was gone, and the Vigilant hung alone in orbit, above a desert world neither woman had expected to see again, carrying with it the full weight of everything they knew, and everything they might now unmake. The Vigilant descended through Tatooine's thin atmosphere, with a grace that belied its unfamiliar, Starfleet-derived engineering, and Ahsoka found herself gripping the edge of a console she didn't fully understand, watching the twin suns burn gold and white across a horizon of endless dunes. She had walked this planet before, after Order 66, after everything, but never like this. Never with the ship's sensors painting a year she hadn't lived through yet on the display in front of her. Life signs, Leia said, scanning the readout, with the ease of someone who'd spent a lifetime aboard command bridges, rebel and otherwise. Mos Espas about 200 kilometers northwest. Population clusters match what I'd expect for a Hutt-controlled trade town. She paused. Ahsoka, I'm picking up a Force signature. Ahsoka already knew. She'd felt it the moment they broke atmosphere. A small, impossibly bright presence pulsing against the desert's dead quiet like a star that had wandered too close to a world that couldn't hold it. She had felt something like it once before, faintly, secondhand. In old Jedi Temple records she'd combed through years after the Order's fall. She had never expected to feel it live. That's him, she said quietly. That's Anakin. Leia's hands stilled over the console. Ahsoka understood the particular silence that followed. Leia had grown up believing her father was Bail Organa, had spent decades after Bespin reconciling herself to Vader, to Anakin, to the terrible math of loving a monster who had once been a boy. Now that boy's Force signature was blazing on a sensor screen less than 300 kilometers away. Still innocent, still enslaved, still 9 years old, and utterly unaware of what history had planned for him. We can't just walk in and buy his freedom, Leia said, recovering her composure the way she always had, by turning grief into strategy. Slavery's illegal under Republic law, which means it doesn't exist here in any way the Republic enforces. Whoever owns him won't sell easily, and even if they did, we'd be flagging ourselves to every bounty hunter and Hutt enforcer on the planet. I know, Ahsoka said. I spent enough time undercover, in Republic space, during the war to know how these transactions work. We don't come in as liberators. We come in as buyers, traders, people with credits and no questions. She exhaled, feeling old instincts from a war she'd fought as a teenager under Anakin's own command, settling back into her bones like a well-worn cloak. Watto's the one who owns him. Toydarian junk dealer. Gambler. Cares more about profit than principle. But he's not cruel for cruelty's sake. You know him. I know of him. From records. From things Anakin told me once. A long time from now that hasn't happened yet. Ahsoka allowed herself a small, humorless smile at the strangeness of her own sentence. This is going to take some getting used to. They set the Vigilant down in a shielded ravine outside. Mos Espa, Hugh's gift came, equipped with a cloaking field, considerably more sophisticated than anything the Republic or the Empire would develop for decades, and Ahsoka intended to make full use of it. Neither woman wanted to explain a starship of impossible design to whatever local authority might come sniffing. The walk into Mos Espa hit Ahsoka with a wave of sensory memory so vivid it nearly staggered her. The dry rasp of sand against permacrete, the tang of scorched durasteel and pack beast dung baking under twin suns, the distant wail of a Jawa sandcrawler's horn somewhere out past the settlement's edge. She had walked streets like these 100 times in her life, on 100 worlds. But there was something uniquely disorienting about walking them a year before the boy she'd once served under had ever ignited a lightsaber. Leia, dressed now in a plain desert cloak the Vigilance replicator had produced, moved beside her with the watchful calm of a woman who had negotiated with Jabba's court, faced down Grand Moffs, and talked her way out of an Imperial interrogation cell. Tatooine's markets held no terror for her. They found Watto's shop tucked into a narrow alley off the main thoroughfare, a cluttered junkyard of speeder parts, droid components, and salvage of dubious origin, presided over by a small blue Toydarian hovering irritably above a workbench, berating a protocol droid missing half its outer plating. And there, kneeling beside a disassembled pod racer, engine with grease-streaked hands and an expression of fierce, focused concentration that Ahsoka recognized instantly, heartbreakingly, was a small boy. Anakin Skywalker looked up as their shadows fell across the doorway, and even at 9 years old, even a full year before Qui-Gon Jinn would ever set foot on this planet, his eyes held the same startling, luminous curiosity Ahsoka remembered from a war that hadn't started yet, from a master she had loved and lost and would now, impossibly, have the chance to know as a child instead of a legend. "Are you too lost?" the boy asked, wiping his hands on a rag. Watto doesn't like it when strangers just wander in without buying something. Beside her, Ahsoka felt Leia go very still. The way a person goes still when confronted with the impossible made suddenly, achingly real. "No," Ahsoka managed, crouching slightly so she wasn't looming over him, letting the Force settle, quiet and calm around her the way she'd once taught her own Padawan to do. "We're not lost. We're exactly where we meant to be." The boy tilted his head, studying her with an intensity that made her wonder, not for the first time, and not for the last, just how much the Force itself already knew about the storm gathering around this small, sand-streaked engineer's shop on the edge of nowhere. Watto's shop smelled of scorched wiring and hydraulic fluid, and the Toydarian himself descended from his hover perch the moment he registered the word buying in his peripheral hearing, his stubby wings beating fast enough to stir the dust on his cluttered workbench. "You too want something, or you just admiring my junk?" Watto's Huttese accented. Basic carried the particular impatience of a man who had learned long ago that time spent not haggling was time spent losing credits. "Parts," Leia said smoothly, already stepping into the role with the ease of a woman who had once talked her way past an entire garrison of Death Star troopers using nothing but the authority in her voice. "Hyperdrive components, mostly. We heard you had the best stock this side of Mos Espa." Watto's eyes, small, avaricious, calculating, lit up at the flattery. Exactly as Ahsoka had hoped. "Best stock on the whole planet," he corrected, hovering closer, sizing them up in the particular way of a man deciding how much he could charge before the deal collapsed. "You got credits?" "Real credits. Not that Republic script nonsense." "Real credits," Leia confirmed, and Ahsoka watched her produce a small pouch of currency the Vigilance replicator had fabricated to match period accurate. Republic minting, untraceable, unremarkable, exactly enough to establish credibility without inviting suspicion. While Leia settled into the haggling, and she was good at it, better than Ahsoka had expected, drawing on some deep well of experience negotiating with smugglers and crime lords across a lifetime. Watto couldn't begin to imagine. Ahsoka let her attention drift back to the boy still crouched over his podracer engine in the corner of the shop. Anakin had returned to his work, but she could feel him listening, feel the flicker of his attention every time Leia's voice rose or fell, every time Watto's wings buzzed with irritation at a counteroffer. There was something achingly familiar in the way he pretended not to care about the adults' business while tracking every word of it. She'd seen that same performance 1,000 times from Padawans trying to look uninterested in matters clearly above their pay grade. "You're good with machines," Ahsoka said, crouching beside him again, keeping her voice low enough not to interrupt the negotiation happening a few meters away. "I built that pod racer engine myself," Anakin said, unable to keep the pride out of his voice. "Well, most of it. Watto says I've got a gift. Says machines just make sense to me." He glanced up at her, that Same startling curiosity from before. You're not from around here. Your accent's weird. And you? He hesitated, studying her montrals and Leku with open, guileless curiosity, rather than the fear or hostility she sometimes got from strangers. What are you? I've never seen anyone who looks like you before. Togruta, Ahsoka said, from a planet called Shirley. Not many of us make it out this far into the rim. Is it far? Very far. She allowed herself a small smile. Farther than you can imagine right now. But someday, if things go the way I hope, you'll see more of the galaxy than most people ever do. Something in her tone must have carried more weight than she intended, because the boy went quiet, studying her with an expression far too perceptive for a 9-year-old slave who had never left this desert world. You say that like you know something, he said slowly. Ahsoka felt the force ripple faintly around them both, his instincts, raw and untrained but undeniably present, brushing up against the careful walls she was trying to keep around her own certainty about the future. She thought of every version of this boy she had ever known, the reckless young Jedi Knight who'd once called her Snips, the burned and broken thing in black armor she'd faced across a lightsaber duel in Malachor's ruins, the redeemed spirit who'd stood beside Luke and Obi-Wan at the end of everything. I know exactly what I'm risking by being here, she thought. I know exactly what's at stake if I get this wrong. I know you're capable of more than anyone here gives you credit for, she said instead, choosing her words with the care of someone defusing a thermal detonator. That's all. Across the shop, the negotiation reached its conclusion. Leia had, through some combination of charm, feigned indifference, and the ruthless application of Republic-era market knowledge she technically shouldn't have possessed, secured a genuine bargain on hyperdrive parts neither of them actually needed, purely to establish themselves as legitimate, recurring customers. Watto seemed thoroughly pleased with himself, entirely unaware he'd been masterfully played by a former rebel general who'd once out-negotiated Lando Calrissian. You two come back anytime, Watto said, already eyeing Leia's credit pouch with the anticipatory hunger of a man planning future transactions. Good customers, good customers. Ani, stop bothering the customers and get back to that engine. He's not bothering us, Ahsoka said, straightening. He was just telling me about his work. He's talented. Watto snorted, though something like reluctant pride flickered across his features. Boy's the best mechanic on Tatooine, slave or free. Podracer champion too, when I let him race. Don't tell him I said so, it'll go to his head. As they turned to leave, Ahsoka caught Anakin's eyes one final time and felt, with a certainty that settled cold and heavy in her chest, that this brief conversation had already changed something. Not dramatically, not visibly, but somewhere in the vast, tangled web of the Force, a thread had shifted, and neither she nor the galaxy would ever quite unshift it again. Outside, beneath the twin suns, Leia exhaled a breath she'd clearly been holding since they entered the shop. That was him, she said quietly. It wasn't a question. That was really him. That was really him, Ahsoka confirmed. And we just became two more people he'll remember for the rest of his life. Somewhere behind them, unseen, a Force presence, far older and far more dangerous than either of them stirred in the depths of a private meditation chamber on Coruscant, a presence that had, for one fleeting moment, felt something in the Force shift on a backwater desert world that shouldn't have mattered to anyone at all. Coruscant's skyline stretched endlessly beneath a haze of speeder traffic and the distant hum of a trillion lives lived atop one another, and in a modest meditation chamber deep within the Jedi Temple, Master Yoda's eyes snapped open with the particular stillness of a being who had felt something the galaxy did not intend for him to feel. He sat in silence for a long moment, letting the ripple settle, testing its edges the way a physician might test a wound to determine its depth. Two presences, bright, brighter than they had any right to be, given how faint their signatures had registered at first contact, as though something was actively working to dim them, to keep them hidden from senses far more attuned than most. Force-sensitive, both of them, powerful, and utterly unknown to him. Master Yoda, Mace Windu's voice, carried the particular gravity it always did when he'd felt something troubling in the Force and wanted confirmation he wasn't imagining it. He stood in the doorway, dark robes settling around him as he crossed into the chamber. You felt it too. Felt it, yes. Understand it, no. Yoda's ears drooped slightly, a gesture of genuine puzzlement rather than his usual performative uncertainty. Two signatures, strong in the Force, yet trained in ways unfamiliar. Old and new at once, this feeling is like meeting an echo before hearing the voice that made it. Windu frowned, settling into the seated position across from him. Location: Outer Rim. Tatooine, I believe. Yoda's frown deepened. Hut space. Far from Jedi eyes, far from Republic law. A strange place for such power to surface. Should we send someone to investigate? Yoda was quiet for a long moment, his jimmer stick tapping softly against the floor in the rhythm he fell into when weighing consequences that stretched further than either of them could presently see. Careful, we must be. Felt this kind of disturbance before. I have not. Not in all my centuries. Not a birth of power, this is. Not a young one discovering their gift for the first time. He looked up, and something almost like unease flickered behind his ancient eyes. Arrived, this power did. Suddenly. Fully formed. As though it does not belong to this moment at all. Windu absorbed that, his expression growing more guarded. In all his years on the council, he had learned to take Yoda's instincts seriously even, especially when they defied easy categorization. You think they're a threat? Think, I do not know what they are. Yoda shook his head slowly. But watch, we should send word to the outer sectors. If crosses Republic space again, this presence does, informed we should be, before decisions we make. Neither of them spoke of the other sensation that had accompanied the disturbance. Fainter, harder to name, but present nonetheless. A sense of wrongness not in a moral sense, but in a temporal one, as though the fabric of causality itself had briefly frayed at the edges and then, just as quickly, begun stitching itself back together in a slightly different pattern than before. Elsewhere in the temple, in a training salle usually reserved for advanced lightsaber forms, a young man not yet 30 stood alone in the center of the room, practicing forms with the kind of disciplined intensity that had already begun to earn him a reputation among his peers as one of the most promising Jedi Knights of his generation. Obi-Wan Kenobi moved through the opening stance of Sarisu with the careful precision his own master had drilled into him. Over more than a decade of training, sweat beating at his temple, his mind, as it so often was these days, only partially present in the exercise. He had felt something, too, fainter than what the council members had registered, filtered through walls and distance, and his own relative, inexperience compared to masters like Yoda and Windu, but present nonetheless, a strange ripple in the force that had disturbed his concentration mid-form, nearly cost him his balance on a transition he'd executed cleanly 1,000 times before. He lowered his lightsaber, breathing hard, and frowned at the empty training salle as though it might offer an explanation. Probably nothing, he told himself. Probably just fatigue. His master, Qui-Gon Jinn, had been away on assignment for weeks now. Negotiations on some border dispute in the mid-rim, the details of which Obi-Wan hadn't been briefed on, and the unaccustomed solitude had left him with too much time to dwell on things that likely didn't warrant the attention he was giving them. And yet, he deactivated his lightsaber and clipped it to his belt, moving to the sal's viewport, looking out over Coruscant's endless towers glittering under a bruised violet sky. Somewhere out there, impossibly far away, in a part of the galaxy he had no reason to think about and even less reason to expect would ever matter to him. Something had shifted. He couldn't have named what he felt. Not fear exactly. Not excitement, either. Something closer to the sensation of a story. Turning a page he hadn't realized was coming. The quiet, unshakable certainty that whatever had just happened, however distant, however unconnected to his own quiet, disciplined life in the temple, it was going to matter to him eventually. He was 9 years too early to know her name. He had no way of knowing that a woman who would, in another version of events entirely, come to know him as one of the great heroes and great tragedies of her lifetime, had just set foot on a desert world that would soon change everything he thought he understood about his place in the galaxy. But the Force remembered, even when the mind did not yet know to listen. And somewhere in its vast, tangled current, a new thread had begun weaving itself into a tapestry that had, until a few short hours ago, seemed as fixed and unchangeable as the stars themselves. The Vigilant dropped out of hyperspace above Mandalore 3 days after their first encounter with Anakin, and Ahsoka felt the shift in atmosphere the moment the planet's cloud-wreathed surface filled the viewport, the sharp, cold tension of a world balanced on the edge of a conflict that hadn't yet fully ignited, but soon would. "Talk me through this again," Leia said, studying the sensor readouts with the focus of a woman assembling a strategic briefing in real time. "You fought in a war here. Years from now, relative to us." "The Clone Wars," Ahsoka confirmed. "Mandalore stayed neutral, officially, under Duchess Satine's pacifist government. But underneath, Death Watch, Mandalorian extremists, who thought her pacifism was a betrayal of their warrior culture, had been organizing for years. Eventually they aligned with Darth Maul, took the capital, executed Satine right in front of Obi-Wan." Ahsoka's jaw tightened at the memory. Even though it hadn't happened yet, even though it might never happen again if she had any say in it, it broke something in him. He was never quite the same after. Leia absorbed that in silence for a moment. And right now, Satine's rule is still fragile but intact. Death Watch is organizing, but they haven't struck yet, not at this scale. If I remember the timeline right, this is close to when their early operations against her government would be escalating. From sabotage to open violence. Ahsoka exhaled. "We have a chance to get ahead of it. Cut the rot out before it spreads." And Obi-Wan hasn't met her yet. Not in this version of events. Anyway, the timeline I remember had them meeting years from now, during a diplomatic crisis. If we handle this now, before he's even involved, we might spare them both the entire tragedy that followed. Ahsoka hesitated, feeling the weight of what she was about to say. Or we might erase something that mattered. I don't know which. That's the problem with all of this. Leia's expression softened, just slightly, the particular understanding of a woman who had spent her own life making impossible choices with incomplete information. "We're not gods, Ahsoka. We can't know every outcome. All we can do is act on what we believe is right and live with what follows." They landed the Vigilant in a shielded ravine outside Sundari, Mandalore's domed capital city, and made their way into the city itself under cover of diplomatic credentials. The ship's systems had fabricated a pair of independent envoys from a Republic-aligned trade consortium, vague enough to avoid scrutiny, credible enough to secure an audience. Sundari's streets were a study in contrasts, gleaming durasteel spires and manicured gardens above, the scars of old wars carefully paved over but never quite hidden from those who knew where to look. Ahsoka felt the tension in the air the moment they passed through the city's outer checkpoints. Armed guards more numerous than the peaceful reputation of Satine's government would suggest. Patrol routes that spoke of a leader who knew, on some level, that her ideals were under siege even if she couldn't yet name the threat directly. They secured an audience with Duchess Satine herself within a day. Leia's diplomatic instincts, honed across a lifetime of Senate politics and Rebel Alliance negotiations, made short work of the new Mandalorian bureaucracy's usual caution. Satine received them in a private chamber overlooking Sundari's central gardens, and Ahsoka found herself studying the woman with an intensity she hoped wasn't too obvious. This was, after all, someone she had only ever known through old recordings. Obi-Wan's rare and carefully guarded mentions of a woman he'd loved and lost. Satine was younger than Ahsoka had expected, though the weight of leadership already sat heavy on her shoulders. A woman in her prime, sharp-eyed, guarded, radiating the particular exhaustion of someone who had spent years fighting a war of ideals against enemies who preferred blasters to arguments. Envoys from a trade consortium rarely request audiences this quickly, Satine said, studying them both with open scrutiny. "Forgive my bluntness, but I find myself curious what you actually want from Mandalore." "Your survival, Duchess," Leia said simply, and Ahsoka watched. Satine's composure flicker, clearly not the answer she'd expected. "We have reason to believe Death Watch's operations against your government are about to escalate significantly. Sabotage, assassination, attempts, an eventual bid to seize Sundari itself with outside help." "And you know this how precisely?" Satine's voice had gone cold, wary, the voice of a leader who had learned to distrust. Convenient information from strangers. Ahsoka met her eyes steadily. Because we've seen where this path leads if nothing changes. I won't insult you by claiming we can prove that to your satisfaction. I'm asking you to consider it anyway, and to let us help you get ahead of the threat before it costs you everything. Satine studied them both for a long, considering moment, the silence stretching taut across the chamber. Ahsoka could feel the Duchess's instincts warring with her caution. The same fundamental decency that had made her beloved by her people, wrestling with the reasonable suspicion of two strangers offering unverifiable warnings about a war that hadn't started yet. Death Watch has been quiet for months, Satine said finally. My intelligence services report nothing beyond the usual fringe agitation. Quiet isn't peace, Leia said. It's preparation. I've seen this pattern before. Extremists gathering strength in the shadows while their targets grow, complacent in the absence of visible threat. When they move, they'll move all at once, and they'll move for your capital. Something in Leia's certainty, the unmistakable weight of hard-won experience rather than mere speculation, seemed to shift. Something in Satine's expression. If what you say is true, she said slowly, what would you have me do? Ahsoka felt the first genuine flicker of hope since they'd arrived in this changed timeline. Let us help you find them, she said. Before they find you first. Outside the chamber's viewport, Sindari's domed sky glowed amber with the fading light of a sun neither Ahsoka nor Leia had ever expected to see from this particular vantage point. And somewhere beyond the horizon, in the shadowed corners of a capital city that still believed itself secure, the first threads of a rebellion that had once ended in tragedy were already beginning, once again, to gather. The Jedi Council's decision to investigate the Tatooine disturbance took the better part of 2 weeks to translate into action. Bureaucracy moved slowly even within an order dedicated to swift justice. And with Kagan Jinn still occupied in the mid-rim and half the council's senior members tied up in a border dispute mediation on Alderaan, the task of following up on Yoda's unsettling premonition fell, somewhat unexpectedly, to a Jedi Knight barely a decade past his own trials. You want me to investigate a potential threat on Tatooine, Obi-Wan said, standing before the assembled council with the carefully neutral expression he'd learned to adopt whenever a mission seemed designed to test him, rather than simply use his talents alone. Not Tatooine directly, Windu corrected. Mandalore, the signature we sensed appears to have moved there in recent days. Our contacts in the sector report unusual diplomatic activity around Duchess Satine's court, 2 individuals matching the description of what we felt. Strong in the Force, unaffiliated with any order we recognize. Careful, you must be, Yoda added, his gaze steady and unusually solemn. Not malevolent, this presence feels, but not entirely knowable either. Watch, listen, learn what you can. Engage in conflict, you should not, unless left with no other choice. Obi-Wan bowed his acceptance, though privately, he found himself more curious than concerned, curious enough that the assignment felt less like a burden and more like an opportunity to prove himself capable of independent judgment, something he'd craved ever since. Qui-Gon's long absences had begun leaving him increasingly to his own devices. He arrived in Sindari 2 days later, traveling under the modest cover of a Republic cultural attaché, inconspicuous, easily explained, granting him enough access to the Duchess's court to make discreet inquiries, without drawing undue attention. It took less than an hour of careful, quiet observation in the palace's outer gardens before he felt it. The same strange ripple in the Force that had disturbed his concentration weeks ago, now unmistakably close, unmistakably strong. He followed the sensation through Sindari's manicured pathways until he found them, 2 women in quiet conversation, near a fountain overlooking the city's central plaza, deep enough in discussion that neither immediately noticed his approach. One was tall, orange-skinned, with distinctive markings and montrals that marked her as a species he didn't immediately recognize. The other moved and spoke with the unmistakable bearing of core world nobility, though something in her eyes suggested a harder life than her polished exterior implied. It was the orange-skinned woman who noticed him first, turning with a speed and precision that spoke of extensive combat training. Her hand drifting, briefly, toward her hip before she visibly caught herself and relaxed the gesture. "You must be the Jedi the Council sent," she said. And there was something in her tone Obi-Wan couldn't quite place, not hostility, but a strange, weighted familiarity, as though she'd been expecting this exact moment for longer than should have been possible. "That's a rather confident assumption," Obi-Wan said carefully, one hand resting near his own lightsaber, without quite committing to the threat of drawing it. "I don't believe we've met." "No," the woman agreed, and something that might have been a smile, sad, complicated, flickered across her features. "Not yet, anyway. My name is Ahsoka. This is Leia." Obi-Wan Kenobi. He studied them both, letting the Force settle around his senses, searching for any hint of ill intent and finding. To his mild surprise, none at all. Only a strange, layered complexity he'd never encountered in a being before, as though each of them carried within them the weight of experiences that didn't belong to this moment in time. "The Jedi Council felt your arrival. They're concerned. Not hostile," he added quickly, seeing something tighten in the one called Ahsoka's expression, but concerned. "Two Force sensitives, with no known training lineage, don't typically appear without explanation." "That's fair," Leia said, stepping forward with the easy confidence of someone well-practiced in diplomatic conversation. "Unfortunately, I don't think we can give you an explanation you'd find easy to believe." "Try me," Obi-Wan said. "I've found the galaxy tends to be stranger than most people give it credit for." Ahsoka and Leia exchanged a glance, a long, silent conversation passing between them that Obi-Wan couldn't begin to interpret, though he found himself oddly certain it concerned him directly. Finally, Ahsoka spoke. "We're here to help protect Duchess Satine from a threat that's about to move against her government," she said. "That much I can tell you plainly. The rest—" She hesitated, studying him with an expression that carried far more weight than the moment seemed to warrant. Something almost like grief, quickly suppressed. "The rest would take more time than we probably have right now, and more trust than you have any reason to give two strangers." "You're being deliberately vague," Obi-Wan observed, though without real heat, more curiosity than accusation. "We are," Leia agreed. "For now, I promise you, Master Kenobi." "Knight," Obi-Wan corrected automatically. "Not yet a master." Something flickered across Leia's face at that, surprise, quickly masked, as though the correction had caught her genuinely off guard. "Knight Kenobi," she amended smoothly, though Obi-Wan noted the brief hesitation with the sharp attention of a man trained to notice inconsistencies. "I promise you, everything we're doing here is meant to protect this galaxy, not endanger it. If Death Watch moves against Satine's government the way we believe they will, you're going to want allies who already understand the shape of that threat." Obi-Wan considered them both for a long moment, weighing Yoda's warning against his own instincts, against the strange, undeniable sense of familiarity that seemed to radiate from both women despite having never met either of them before this exact conversation. There was something in the way Ahsoka looked at him, searching, careful, tinged with an emotion he couldn't name but felt certain, somehow, ran deeper than the few minutes they'd known each other. "All right," he said finally. "Show me what you know about Death Watch's plans. If what you're telling me is true, the Council will want a full report, and I suspect I'll want considerably more answers than you've given me so far." "Fair enough," Ahsoka said, and for just a moment, something that looked almost like relief crossed her features. The relief, Obi-Wan thought, of someone who had been dreading and anticipating this exact meeting in equal measure, for reasons he couldn't begin to guess. Behind them, Sindari's amber sky deepened toward evening, and somewhere beneath the city's gleaming surface, in shadowed chambers where extremists, Mandalorians plotted the death of everything Satine had built. The countdown to violence continued regardless of what any of them now knew or hoped to prevent. The attack came 4 nights later, and Ahsoka felled it building in the Force hours before the first explosion tore through Sindari's lower districts, a gathering pressure like static before a storm that had her reaching for her lightsabers and moving toward the palace's outer perimeter before Satine's own security forces had registered the threat. "They're early," she said to Leia. who fell into step beside her with a blaster pistol drawn from beneath her cloak, a weapon the Vigilance Armory had produced, modified just enough to pass for period-appropriate hardware while retaining a targeting system decades ahead of its time. This isn't supposed to happen for another few weeks, if the pattern holds. Maybe the pattern doesn't hold anymore, Leia said grimly. Maybe we already changed enough that they know we're onto them. The explosion rocked the lower district's power relay station, plunging half of Sindari's southern quarter into darkness. And within minutes the comm channels were alive with reports of armed Mandalorians in Death Watch colors, dark, jagged armor marked with the crimson stripe of Vizslas faction, moving through the smoke toward the palace district, with the coordinated precision of a force that had been planning this assault for months. Obi-Wan met them at the palace's east gate, lightsaber already ignited, his expression a study in focused calm despite the chaos unfolding around them. Security reports at least 30 hostiles, possibly more, converging from 3 directions, he said. They're better organized than typical extremist factions. This isn't a riot. It's a coordinated strike. It's an invasion, Ahsoka corrected, igniting her own twin blades, the familiar white glow steadying something in her chest, even amid the mounting chaos. Or it wants to become one. If they take the palace and capture Satine, this stops being an internal Mandalorian conflict and becomes a full civil war. Then we don't let them take the palace, Leia said, already moving toward the gates. Defensive position with the unhesitating command presence of a woman who'd organized far larger battles against far worse odds. Obi-Wan, can you coordinate with Satine's guard? Get her moved to a secure location, somewhere defensible, away from the main approach routes. Obi-Wan hesitated only a fraction of a second, clearly unaccustomed to taking tactical direction from someone he'd known for less than a week, before nodding sharply. There's a bunker beneath the eastern wing, built for exactly this kind of contingency. I'll get her there. Go, Ahsoka said. We'll hold the gate. He went, and Ahsoka turned to find the first wave of Death Watch fighters already breaching the outer perimeter, their jetpacks flaring orange against the smoke-choked night as they descended over the palace walls in a coordinated assault pattern she recognized instantly. From a war fought years. No, now? Not yet. In the future. What followed was chaos rendered into something almost like art. The particular controlled violence of combat Ahsoka had spent a lifetime mastering. She moved through the first wave of attackers with the fluid brutality of Jar-Kai, combined with a decade of hard-won battlefield instinct. Her lightsabers carving through blaster bolts and armored positions alike while Leia's precision fire covered her flanks, dropping hostiles at range with a marksmanship honed across a lifetime of desperate rebel engagements. Behind you, Leia shouted, and Ahsoka spun just in time to deflect a volley of shots from a Mandalorian wielding a modified Wester blaster rifle, the bolts scattering harmlessly into the palace's ornamental stonework. The fighting pressed them back toward the palace's central courtyard, the Death Watch forces adapting their tactics with unsettling speed once they realized conventional assault wasn't breaking through, shifting to flanking maneuvers, coordinated jetpack strikes from multiple angles, the kind of disciplined warfare that spoke of genuine military training rather than mere extremist fervor. They're better than I remember, Ahsoka called out between exchanges, deflecting another volley while carving a path through the courtyard's defensive choke point. Something's different. Maybe they know we're a threat now, Leia shot back, reloading with practiced efficiency. Maybe intercepting their sabotage runs the last 2 weeks made them escalate faster and harder than they originally planned. The thought settled cold in Ahsoka's chest even as she fought the growing, undeniable realization that their intervention hadn't simply delayed this attack or softened it, but had instead provoked Death Watch into striking with everything they had, all at once, rather than the gradual campaign of sabotage and assassination that history remembered. They had changed the timeline, and the timeline had changed back at them, harder and faster than either of them had accounted for. A new group of attackers broke through the courtyard's eastern approach, and at their head, moving with a confidence and lethality that set every instinct in Ahsoka's body screaming a warning, walked a Mandalorian she recognized instantly despite having only ever seen him in old Historical records. Pre-Vizsla himself, the darksaber ignited and humming in his grip, its black blade cutting an unmistakable silhouette against the smoke-filled night. Interesting, Vizsla said, his modulated voice carrying easily across the courtyard's sudden, tense silence. The Duchess hires Jedi mercenaries now. How very far she's fallen from her precious pacifist principles. We're not Jedi, Ahsoka said, settling into a ready stance. Her twin blades held low and steady. And you're not going to get anywhere near the Duchess tonight. Vizsla's laugh crackled through his helmet's vocoder, cold and confident. We'll see about that. He came at her fast, the darksaber's ancient, unpredictable energy blade clashing against her own with a force that reverberated up through her arms. And Ahsoka understood, in that single violent exchange, that whatever history she remembered about this night had already stopped being reliable, that, from this moment forward, she and Leia were navigating entirely uncharted territory, with nothing but their skill, their instincts, and each other to guide them through whatever came next. The darksaber's blade shrieked against Ahsoka's twin sabers, throwing off sparks of black and white light that painted the courtyard in strobing violent relief. Pre-Vizsla fought with the disciplined ferocity of a lifetime spent mastering the ancient weapon, but Ahsoka had trained against Maul himself, had survived duels against opponents who made Vizsla's raw aggression look almost gentle by comparison. You fight like someone who's held that blade before, Vizsla growled, pressing another combination that Ahsoka deflected with practiced economy of motion. I've fought against it before, she corrected, driving him back a step. Recently, actually. Relatively speaking. She didn't have time to explain further, didn't have time, in truth, to fully process the strangeness of fighting a man whose death she'd witnessed secondhand in old Rebellion-era historical archives, now very much alive and trying with genuine skill to end her life a full generation before he was supposed to. The exchange consumed her focus entirely, each strike and parry demanding total presence, until a sudden shift in the courtyard's energy, a ripple through the force so sharp it felt almost physical, nearly cost her the engagement. Leia. Ahsoka disengaged from Vizsla with a burst of force-assisted speed, putting distance between them long enough to locate her, and found Leia pinned behind a shattered stone column. 3 Death Watch fighters, closing on her position while her blaster's charge indicator blinked a warning red. I'm fine, Leia called out, though the strain in her voice suggested otherwise, firing a precise shot that dropped one attacker before ducking back behind cover. Handle Vizsla, I've got this. But Ahsoka felt something else entirely in that moment, a memory surfacing unbidden, sharp and vivid, of a different battlefield, a different Leia bleeding out in her arms on some Outer Rim world during the war against the First Order, a memory from a future that technically hadn't happened yet in this altered timeline and might never happen at all, and yet felt as real and as urgent as anything Ahsoka had ever experienced. I already lost her once, Ahsoka thought, and the realization crystallized something in her chest, a fierce, protective certainty that overrode every careful calculation about timeline integrity Hugh had warned her to consider. I'm not losing her again. She moved before conscious thought fully caught up with instinct, force pushing Vizsla back hard enough to buy herself 3 critical seconds, then closing the distance to Leia's position with a speed that left after images in the smoke-choked air. Her lightsabers found the remaining attackers with brutal efficiency, and within moments the immediate threat to Leia's position had been eliminated entirely. You didn't have to do that, Leia said, breathing hard, reloading with hands that trembled only slightly. I had it under control. I know, Ahsoka said. I wasn't taking the chance. Something passed between them in that brief exchange, an understanding that went beyond the immediate tactical situation, touching on everything neither of them had fully articulated since Hugh first pulled them back into existence. They had both died once already, in futures that this altered timeline might now never produce. They had both, in their own ways, learned exactly how fragile even the most seemingly permanent things could prove to be. Vizsla recovered his footing and came at Ahsoka again. But something in his approach had shifted, more cautious now, reassessing an opponent who'd just demonstrated capabilities well beyond what he'd initially calculated. Who are you? He demanded, circling warily. No Jedi fights like you do. No mercenary either. Someone who's seen exactly where this path leads you, Ahsoka said. And I'm telling you now, it doesn't end well. Not for you. Not for Death Watch. Not for Mandalore. You know nothing about Mandalore's future, Vizsla spat. I know more than you'd believe, Ahsoka said quietly. And for just a moment, beneath the exhaustion and adrenaline of battle, something like genuine sorrow crept into her voice. I know you die for this cause eventually. I know it costs you everything and changes nothing you actually wanted. There's still time to choose a different path. Vizsla's laugh was sharp, humorless. Sentiment. From a Jedi who claims not to be one. He raised the darksaber again. I don't need your pity. I need Mandalore free from that pacifist coward's rule, whatever the cost. The battle resumed, but something in Ahsoka had shifted during that brief exchange. A growing certainty that Q's warnings about the fragility of changed timelines carried weight she couldn't ignore. Every choice she and Leia made rippled outward in ways neither of them could fully predict or control. Saving Anakin from the fate she remembered might mean nothing if they inadvertently created new tragedies to replace the old ones. Protecting Leia from a death that technically hadn't happened yet in this altered version of events meant nothing if Mandalore burned regardless of their intervention. Across the courtyard, she caught sight of Obi-Wan emerging from the palace's eastern wing, having successfully secured Satine in the underground bunker, his expression grim as he assessed the ongoing battle's scope and intensity. Their eyes met briefly across the chaos, and Ahsoka felt, with unsettling clarity, the weight of a future she'd once known dissolving further with every passing moment. Obi-Wan fighting alongside her in a battle history had never recorded, Satine sheltered by his intervention weeks before their canonical meeting had ever been scheduled to occur. Everything is different now, she thought, parrying another of Vizsla's strikes with growing urgency. And I don't know anymore whether that's a victory or a catastrophe still waiting to reveal itself. The battle raged on, and somewhere beneath the courtyard's violence, the true cost of rewriting destiny continued revealing itself one desperate exchange at a time. The battle for Sundari's palace reached its breaking point as dawn's first gray light began bleeding through the smoke hanging over the courtyard, and Ahsoka felt Vizsla's exhaustion finally beginning to match her own. The darksaber's strikes coming slower now, less precise, the accumulated toll of a battle that had raged for nearly 6 hours without meaningful pause. But exhaustion wasn't the only thing shifting in the courtyard's charged atmosphere. Ahsoka felt it first as a distant pressure at the edge of her senses, cold, patient, utterly unlike the chaotic fury of Death Watch's remaining fighters. She'd felt that particular signature only once before, in a memory that belonged to a future now growing steadily less certain. The unmistakable weight of the dark side, focused and deliberate, watching from somewhere beyond the immediate battle. Someone's here, she called out to Leia, who had taken up a defensive position near the palace's shattered eastern colonnade, still holding her own against the last scattered pockets of Death Watch resistance. Someone's watching. Leia's expression sharpened with understanding even before Ahsoka finished the warning. Sith, or something close to it. Ahsoka scanned the courtyard's smoke-wreathed perimeter, every instinct screaming that the true threat of this night hadn't yet fully revealed itself. Vizsla and his Death Watch fighters were formidable, but the presence she felt now carried a different weight entirely. Ancient, calculating, patient in a way that suggested someone had been observing this entire engagement from a careful distance, waiting to see how the pieces fell before committing to any action of their own. She didn't have to wait long for confirmation. A figure emerged from the smoke at the courtyard's northern edge, tall, robed in dark fabric that seemed to absorb the pale dawn light rather than reflect it, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never once doubted their own superiority in any engagement they chose to enter. Ahsoka didn't recognize the face, but she recognized the signature instantly. Viscerally, a Sith apprentice, trained in shadow, sent to observe rather than engage until this exact moment presented itself. Not Maul, not Dooku, not yet publicly a Sith Lord in this timeline regardless. Someone else entirely, a variable. Ahsoka's memory of the original timeline held no record of whatsoever. You've caused quite a disturbance, the figure said. voice carrying easily across the battle-scarred courtyard, addressing Ahsoka and Leia directly while Vizslas' remaining forces fell back, visibly unnerved by this new arrival's presence. Two Force signatures appearing from nowhere, rewriting a timeline that was proceeding exactly as intended. My master finds that interesting. Your master, Ahsoka repeated carefully, every instinct sharpening toward the deeper threat this revelation implied. Sidious knows about us. Something flickered across the hooded figure's expression, surprise, quickly suppressed at hearing that name spoken so directly. You know more than you should, the figure said, which only confirms what we suspected. You're not simply Force sensitives who wandered into the wrong sector of space. You know things about this timeline's intended trajectory, things that shouldn't be knowable by anyone currently alive. Leia moved to stand beside Ahsoka, blaster still raised, her expression hardening with the particular resolve Ahsoka had come to recognize as the look of a woman, calculating impossible odds and choosing to fight anyway. Whatever you think you know about us, Leia said, it changes nothing about tonight. Mandalore isn't yours to claim, and neither is this galaxy's future. The figure's laugh was soft, almost gentle, entirely more unsettling for its lack of visible malice. The future was never anyone's to claim, exactly. It simply happens, according to forces far older and far more patient than either of you seem to appreciate. The figure's hand drifted toward a weapon hidden beneath dark robes. But I confess, my master is curious what happens when that inevitability meets genuine resistance. Consider tonight a test, nothing more. The ensuing engagement tested every reserve of skill and endurance Ahsoka possessed. The Sith apprentice fought with a controlled, calculating precision entirely different from Vizslas' raw aggression, testing, probing, clearly more interested in gathering information about their capabilities than achieving any decisive victory. Ahsoka matched the engagement with everything she'd learned across a lifetime of conflict, drawing on techniques from her time fighting Maul, from her training under both Anakin and the Jedi Order's more traditional masters, from hard-won instincts developed across a war this apprentice's master hadn't yet even fully set into motion. Beside her, Leia fought with equal desperation, her blaster fire finding gaps in the apprentice's defenses whenever Ahsoka's lightsabers forced an opening, the two of them moving with the seamless coordination of partners who had, in some sense, been fighting alongside each other across multiple lifetimes, even if this particular collaboration was entirely new. It was Obi-Wan's arrival that finally shifted the engagement's balance, emerging from the palace's eastern wing with Satine safely secured behind him, his lightsaber igniting as he moved to reinforce Ahsoka and Leia's position with the disciplined precision of Jedi training layered over genuine tactical instinct, facing three capable opponents rather than two, and having apparently gathered whatever information his mysterious master required. The Sith apprentice disengaged with the same unhurried confidence he'd arrived with. This was illuminating, he said, already retreating toward the courtyard's smoke-obscured perimeter. My master will be very interested in what you've shown us tonight. And then he was gone, vanishing into the smoke and shadow as quickly as he'd appeared, leaving behind a courtyard littered with the aftermath of battle and a question that settled cold and heavy in Ahsoka's chest. If Sidious already knew about their presence, already understood, they carried knowledge of a timeline he hadn't intended, then everything they'd assumed about acting in secret, about quietly reshaping events from the shadows, had just become considerably more complicated than either of them had ever anticipated. Vizslas' remaining forces, seeing their Sith observer withdraw and their own numbers decimated across the long night's fighting, broke and scattered into Sindari's smoke-choked streets. The immediate threat to Satine's government finally, exhaustedly repelled. But as dawn fully broke over Mandalore's battle-scarred capital, Ahsoka understood with unsettling clarity that tonight's victory had come at a cost far steeper than the visible damage surrounding them. They were no longer operating unseen, no longer simply two mysterious women, quietly nudging history toward a better outcome. Somewhere in the galaxy's shadows, the architect of everything she and Leia had once fought and died to defeat now knew their names, their capabilities, and quite possibly the full weight of what they carried. In the aftermath of the battle, Sindari's palace became a place of careful, cautious rebuilding, repair crews clearing rubble, Satine's government moving swiftly to consolidate control before Death Watch's scattered remnants could regroup, and three very different people standing amid the wreckage, trying to understand exactly what they'd set into motion. Satine emerged from the underground bunker as the last smoke cleared, moving directly to where Ahsoka, Leia, and Obi-Wan stood in the courtyard's ruined center. "You saved my government tonight," she said, studying all three of them, with an expression that mixed genuine gratitude with lingering, understandable wariness. "I think I deserve to know who you actually are." Ahsoka exchanged a glance with Leia, a silent conversation, weighing the risks of honesty against the necessity of trust moving forward. "The truth is complicated," Ahsoka said finally. "More complicated than you'd easily believe. But I can tell you this much. We're not here to control Mandalore's future, or the Republic's, or anyone else's. We're here because we know how much can be lost when good people don't get the chance to choose their own path forward. Tonight, you kept that chance. That's enough for now." Satine studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly, accepting the incomplete answer with the grace of a leader who understood some mysteries resolved themselves only with time. Beside her, Obi-Wan remained quiet. Though the look he gave, Ahsoka carried a new depth of consideration, not quite trust. Not yet, but something adjacent to it. A recognition that whatever these two women were, they had fought beside him with genuine conviction when it mattered most. In the weeks that followed, word reached the vigilant sensors of ripples spreading outward from that single transformed night, Satine's government emerging, strengthened rather than shattered. Death Watch's remaining influence fractured and diminished. Obi-Wan Kenobi returning to Coruscant with a report that would forever complicate the Jedi Council's understanding of the galaxy's hidden currents. On Tatooine, a young boy named Anakin Skywalker continued disassembling engines under twin suns, unaware that the timeline meant to claim him in less than a year's time had already begun, bending towards something unrecognizable. Aboard the Vigilant, Ahsoka watched Mandalore's cloud-wreathed surface recede into starlight, uncertain whether the future she'd once known would even recognize itself in whatever came next, but certain, at least, that this time, they would face it with their eyes open. Against all odds, two women who had died for a galaxy already lost had returned to give it something history never offered them, the first time, a choice. But in the shadows beyond the stars, a patient darkness was already watching, already calculating what their defiance might cost them all before this story ever reached its end. May the Force be with you.